Welcome, comrades. You're listening to The Party Line, the podcast from The Ditch on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Niamh Ní Bhriain, and you can follow The Party Line wherever you watch or listen to podcasts, and follow The Ditch on all your apps. And we're back again this week, and we have Roman back with us again from The Ditch.
Hi, Roman. As some of you may recall, Niamh spent several days in Cuba recently. What is it like for a whole society to be starved of fuel because of conditions imposed from the outside? And what consequences follow from that? We may all be soon to find out, if you believe some of the catastrophists among us, but Cuba has been living through this catastrophe upon catastrophe for months now, and in some respects for many years.
Yeah, so we'll get into that, I think, in the second part of the podcast. But I think for the first part, we'll have our usual slot, where we're going to talk to Roman about The Ditch. And this week, instead of focusing in on a particular story from The Ditch, we're going to look at actually the work The Ditch has been doing on legal cases. So maybe, Roman, as the legal expert, you can tell us a little bit more about the work.
Yeah, because we do a lot of taking the piss out of other media all the time, but the work that The Ditch does on this front is actually useful for all journalists, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we're certainly hoping to do more of it. I mean, we took a couple of judicial reviews over the past couple of years against local authorities for not keeping proper ethics registers, or not even making them accessible to the public as they're required to do. And we took a case against the Standards and Public Office Commission as well for not releasing donation statements. And all of those cases were successful. And we have now started the process to becoming a company limited by guarantee, which means that we are effectively going to be a non-profit organization. And also, I think, we have certain objectives now as part of that, which I think, will allow us to kind of do more kind of that type of stuff. Like, I think like kind of cases that are going to benefit, hopefully, journalists who are trying to access records, and maybe another kind of addition to some of the type of work that people like Ken Fox are doing in terms of transparency and democracy. And I think we're going to be focusing on various different areas, and just hopefully making things a little bit easier for investigative journalists.
Great. I mean, not everyone in the audience perhaps knows it, but you sort of personify where the ditch's commitment to journalism meets its commitment to kind of pursuing things through legal avenues. You're a solicitor yourself. You have experience in that area. You also, of course, have been doing some of the great investigative work that the ditch has been carrying out over the years. So this intersection of legal and journalistic pursuits that the ditch is going to do, and particularly as you've explained through this new legal structure, is kind of very much your baby, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt that, and that's one of the reasons I got involved with the ditch from the start as a co-founder, was because I've always felt that there is this kind of, there was this gap between journalism and law, and it's very interesting when they fuse together. The outcomes can be amazing in terms of exposing wrongdoing in public bodies, or like we did with On Board Pleanála, just utilizing legislation that allows you to access records, and figuring out how that works, figuring out what records you're entitled to get, and then using those records to create news, and not only to create news, but to create news that actually has consequences. So in the case of On Board Pleanála, its deputy chairperson was criminally convicted on foot of the records that we got and the stories that we published, which I think, it is quite significant. It doesn't always happen it's difficult to get those sort of outcomes. But I think it's a very powerful tool for holding the state to account. Is just merging um, investigative journalism and public law or administrative law together to kind of create this very powerful tool that holds the state to account.
Yeah, as you say, other journalists have done some of this sort of thing before, but you are especially, and the ditch is now especially equipped to kind of do this quite systematically. And as you say, it's a question of accountability and of transparency. The ditch as kind of as a kind of an NGO for radical transparency in state bodies.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of, I think, the kind of trajectory now. The ditch has always been about investigative journalism, but I think there's been a realization over the past couple of years that there might be a way to kind of streamline that, and to make it maybe a little bit more efficient, and a little bit more organized. And I don't know. I mean, I'd kind of be hopeful that maybe it creates some sort of a precedent. It would be great to see, maybe younger lawyers or younger investigative journalists kind of coming together like that, creating their own organizations as well. We've seen a great example is, I think a couple of guys we spoke to a few years ago created a kind of a map on a website. That's not the technical term, but they created some sort of a program on a website where they were tracking every Airbnb in the country. And they had it all mapped out in various different areas. So that sort of stuff, like even kind of, again, to bring in a kind of a third, a third kind of vein or whatever would be, the fusion of law, journalism, and data. I mean, that can be amazing as well.
I swear the educator in me is seeing modules and courses and all sorts of things coming out of this, bringing together these different strands. It's really, really fascinating. Thanks, Roman. That's really interesting. Um, I think we're gonna move on, and we're all feeling very virtuous, I think, Roman, after that excursion into the ditch's work. So it's time to turn our attention to the non-ditch media segment of the episode, which we also feel very, very virtuous about because we made the ultimate sacrifice. We read Ian O'Doherty in The Spectator so that you don't have to. For those who don't know, Ian O'Doherty is he's an awful bollocks, actually, and I don't even think that's defamatory because I think Ian O'Doherty would say that himself. It's kind of his persona. There are a lot of commentators on the Irish right that I wouldn't say that about, but Ian, no, he's just troublesome. But I do get a kick out of this piece about Cuba and about what he calls the luxury leftists on the flotilla to Cuba, because it is in a special subgenre of Irish journalism. It's when an Irish journalist gets a much better paying slot in a British magazine and then is really careful to tick all of the boxes that the British right would want from someone taking on that role. So the headline in this piece was "Kneecaps Breathtaking Cuban Hypocrisy." And, having been a columnist myself, I know it's usually the case when you say breathtaking hypocrisy, you mean that someone has different beliefs and priorities from the ones that you do. This column is indeed about the very trip to Cuba that Niamh, you were on. So, and here's what Ian says about it. It wasn't so much an international flotilla of protesters as the lineup for the next Guardian tent at Glastonbury. So a real good British right-wing column box ticked there. He throws in a bit of a Game of Thrones reference. He calls Jeremy Corbyn what is it, the Wild Sparrow or something? High Sparrow. Sorry, the High Sparrow. I don't watch Game of Thrones. And of course, then just to make sure that he's good with his British editors, He refers to NECAP, citing the special Irish solidarity with people who've been hungry and colonized and oppressed, and he calls that a typically inventive approach to historical reality. So 1, 2, 3, your easy peasy spectator sneers at Irish culture, at popular culture, and at liberal left culture all in one place. I think the idea that The Guardian is kind of a host to this kind of leftist activity is a little bit out of date, but anyway, we'll take it. And we will, I think, Niamh, maybe talk about the luxury leftists on the in Cuba in a few minutes and why celebrities were such a big part of that. But what is noticeable in Ian's story here is that there's not even a scratch of a reference in 900 words about how Cuba came to be a beleaguered country that an aid flotilla was going to, other than its own bad government. He does have a phrase where he says Cuba's enmity with the U.S., but you think that was just a vibe if you read this story, that there's no actual material history to that. Cuba has this enmity just to look cool with the other kids, so that when Hassan Piker comes down from America, it's like, hey, we have enmity with the U.S. too. He says that, and he suggests, as they often do, that any display of principled solidarity with the likes of Cuba or any other oppressed nation is essentially cynical piece of business. Like so many pound shop provocateurs before them, Ian writes, NECAP and their manager know exactly what side their bread is buttered on. So somehow this nonsense suggesting that NECAP went to Cuba to sell something, his market fundamentalism kind of breaks down, because I thought doing stuff for profit was good and that it serves society when people do things that are going to be profitable. But in any case, the idea that that celebrities went to Cuba to make money, to sell more stuff, to get more clicks, to be ever more successful influencers is something that I think we saw in a lot of the press coverage of the what became described in some places as a junket to Cuba. Niamh, you were there.
Yeah. I mean, just first on this piece, I mean, it's incredible that you could write 900 words about Cuba and not mention at all the fact that it's been blockaded by the US since 1962. Like that is an you know it's horrific that you would write a piece that would leave out that particular
Even
detail, which
even
is,
in parentheses, you might mention it.
you know,
Even if your main thing is to say, yeah, all the cool kids think Cuba is cool or whatever, but we know better. You'd have to say something about the basic material reality.
yeah, I mean, it's, this is the blockade on Cuba. It's not a fiction. It's been voted on 33 times at the United Nations General Assembly. It's something that's being actively implemented and intensified for decades. But yeah, he decided, as this piece is actually just one of many in terms of how the aid convoy to Cuba was covered. And just on NECAP, I mean, I saw a number of while I was in Cuba, I didn't have that much access to internet because I'm not great with tech, and I had bought an eSIM which I failed to activate, and then I couldn't get a Cuban SIM card while I was there. So I only saw a lot of this coverage actually after I left Cuba. And one of the things that I saw repeatedly was that NECAP actually caused the nationwide blackout, which is just an incredible twist on the fact that because of the blockade, again, if you don't talk about the blockade as the cause for the blackout, then let's blame it on NECAP or, all of these people who went to Cuba with the aid flotilla, and that we signified such an increment on the Cuban resources that we caused the blackout. So all of these things to say, to avoid actually speaking about the reality, which is that Cuba has been under an illegal blockade for over 6 decades.
So let's talk about that reality and about the idea of bringing aid, which was something that was desperately needed. And what the nature of the aid that you personally brought was quite striking, wasn't it? In light of the kind of blockade that is being inflicted on the Cuban people.
Yeah, so I suppose the whole thing came about because following the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro at the beginning of the year on the 3rd of January. So after that, then the flow of Venezuelan oil to Cuba stopped. So basically, Cuba hadn't received as we're recording this, it now has received. But when we went to Cuba on the flotilla or the convoy, Cuba hadn't received any oil for 3 months. And so there was an intensification of the blockade, and a call went out. The call was put out by Progressive International, and it was received by hundreds of people all over the world. A call went out that we would join an international aid flotilla or convoy. It started out being called a flotilla, and then it was called convoy Nuestra América.
Yeah, you didn't float yourself. You flew.
No, I flew. And there was a request actually, because in the weeks leading up to us traveling to Cuba, there was, and the Irish government put out through the embassy that people would not travel to Cuba. So there was a call from different embassies that people wouldn't travel to Cuba, which is of course another dimension of cutting off foreign currency, because Cuba is, tourism is hugely important for Cuba, for the survival of Cuba in terms of getting access to foreign currency, because again, part of the blockade has been that Cuba has been removed from international banking. Even to travel to Cuba to get your visa, to actually pay the money for that visa, you have to go to the post office and get a postal order and send it to the Cuban embassy. So, Cuba is completely outside of the banking system. And so tourism for Cuba is really important. So one of the call outs with the aid flotilla or the aid convoy was that people would fly. So we would kind of force the airlines to continue to operate. So the call went out, I think it was the end of February, beginning of March, that there would be an aid convoy that would travel to Cuba. It's important to mention that it wasn't kind of this idea of poor Cuba needs our help. It was that Cuba has sent, since the revolution, Cuba has sent 600,000 medical personnel all over the world to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, to, post-hurricane, post-earthquake sites all around the world. People have deployed from Cuba to provide emergency medical care. And so it was, in a way, a form of returning that solidarity. And it was actually really beautiful. A lot of the people who joined the convoy were people who had been trained in Cuba at the Latin American School of Medicine, the ELAM, it's called in Spanish, that a lot of the people who joined had actually trained as medical professionals in Cuba for free. And then they, one of them was a doctor who's working now in Nicaragua. He's from Nicaragua. And there were many like him who owed their professional careers to Cuba. And so they were returning with medical aid in solidarity.
So medical aid was what you were bringing as well.
Yeah. So I put a call out with the help of my sister Lorraine, who's based in Belfast. I put a call out for support for medical aid, because it was, if you can just imagine as well, dimension, and if you to kind of, the absolute obscenity of the blockade was that we were all given, I think it was 5 or 6 pages of medical supplies that we were asked to bring with us. And, one entire page of that was dedicated to cancer medication, and if people don't get that medication, they will die. That's the reality of the blockade. People die because of the blockade on Cuba. And, if there were bombs being dropped on Cuba, it would probably be in the media more often. But it's kind of this slow, but constant genocide, because the idea is that you will, there's a direct quote about, I think I have it here in front of me. It's about creating the conditions so that you bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. Now that's from 1960, that quote. And that is still the policy today.
That's from the American government.
That's from a CIA agent from 1960. And then you have after that the installation of the blockade. And the idea is that you provoke hunger. And while I was there, I spoke to lots of people who are hungry. Like I remember I spoke to a woman in a museum who hadn't had breakfast that morning. She was able to drink coffee in the museum. She hadn't breakfast. She wasn't going to be able to have lunch. She'd no idea how she was going to gather something together to make dinner. And people are literally living from hand to mouth. And that's just one story of many. People are really actually experiencing hunger. People are eating one meal a day. Parents are choosing to feed their children instead of feeding themselves. There is food arriving. There was the same woman told me that she had received a tin of fish that came on, there was a humanitarian aid ship that came from Mexico. But I mean, the tin of fish is long gone. So even just bringing this aid is a drop in the ocean. Like what Cuba needs is for the blockade to be lifted. That's, lift the blockade and let Cubans, just live without this, a boot on their neck. Like just on my way to the airport when I was leaving, the taxi driver, the price of a taxi now to the airport costs a fortune because of the fuel crisis. There's a black market for fuel. So basically, they kind of explained how it operates, and it costs about $10 now to buy a litre of fuel on the black market. So that's how some people can manage to keep their cars on the road, but who, access to $10, that could be a monthly salary for some Cuban people. And he said to me when I got in and he told me the price of the taxi, he was like, the US has its boot on our neck. He's like, I'm sorry I have to charge you so much, but this is just the reality. I can't keep the car on the road unless I buy fuel from the black market, and these are the current prices.
Now, you couldn't bring in fuel, obviously. You brought 2 suitcases full of painkillers mostly, wasn't it? Was that the
Yeah,
largely
so
what you did?
I had my sister in Belfast got in touch with her circles in Belfast through Mothers Against Genocide, and they managed to get their hands on, also a lot of medication. A lot of it was painkillers, but one of the best things we could bring was actually asthma inhalers. Because I have a Cuban friend who had told me that her daughter her inhaler had run out. And then I said, well, if your daughter's inhaler has she doesn't have an inhaler, I presume no other children have inhalers. And effectively that was the case. There were no inhalers. So the fantastic women of Belfast managed to gather dozens of inhalers, which I was able to bring. Then I got a very generous donation of hundreds of antibiotics from Galway, which, they will save people's lives. You can die from an infection. And, again, the absolute, the criminality of blocking the entrance of antibiotics to Cuba so that I have to, through my contacts, manage to get a medical professional in Galway to donate antibiotics that I then pack into a suitcase and fly to Cuba so that people can stay alive.
It's a bit inefficient, all right. And it's interesting, we're oscillating a little bit between this. Like on the one hand, of course, a convoy of this nature is effectively symbolic in a way of drawing attention to the blockade and demanding an end to it. And yet, on the other hand, this drop in the ocean is still achieving something, and that it was an act of support and solidarity beyond the political. It was a human gift, and as you said, a returning of a gift that the Cuban people have shared so often with others.
Yeah, and I think every morning on Cuban TV and every evening there was a story about the convoy, and it got a lot of media attention in Cuba. And people were talking about it on the streets, and it did, I suppose, generate a momentum that, Cuba is not alone. So the kind of one of the expressions from the convoy was Cuba no está sola, like Cuba is not alone. And that was none of us went there thinking, well, my 2 suitcases are going to resolve this, and I think it was more, in total, there were 650 people from 33 countries. And I think in total it was about 50 tons of aid. And that's, between different types of medical supplies. Some of them will obviously be directly related to cancer medication, antibiotics. And then I got another very generous donation of personal protective equipment so that surgeons, when they're carrying out surgery, can use proper, masks, goggles, and this kind of equipment. So there was, I also got generous financial donations. And one of the most touching was in the name of a woman who said she owed her life to the Cuban doctors who oversaw her care as a child in southern Africa, where she had a childhood illness. And, she said she would have died had it not been for the free care that was provided. So I think a lot of the criticism of the convoy was around this idea that these people are white saviors who are bringing medical aid to Cuba, and then kind of posting about it in social media. And I'm not saying there wasn't that, because that probably did happen for many people. And there was an awful lot of, focus in on kind of the influencers that attended and that kind of thing. But the vast majority, like from Ireland, there were 19 people. I was one of a group of 19. And just normal people who feel solidarity with Cuba and were able to, within their own circles, gather suitcases together, gather, financial donations, whatever, and made their way, we made our way to Cuba and participated in the convoy.
And of course, just because you're a celebrity or an influencer doesn't mean you are not part of that as well. I mean, you said that NICAP were extremely sound and
yeah, no, of course. And I'm including them in the 19 as the normal people.
So who are the abnormal people? Tell us, Niamh.
I mean, I can't name any names, but no, and there was some distasteful influencer behavior, I would say. And the way the convoy was set up lent itself to that. Again, I'm not talking about Irish. The Irish contingent was, again, and I'm including NICAP, it was all just people who genuinely felt like, we should come together and do something about this, and gathered our suitcase together and flew to Cuba. But yeah, I mean, again, I didn't see any of this stuff online until I came back. But when I was in Cuba, there was just a sense of, within the organizing structure of how the convoy took place, hundreds of us were participating in these pre-convoy departure meetings for weeks and weeks, and then, at no point were we told that we needed to actually register for the events in Havana. And then when we got there, we realized that a registration was necessary. And only some people had been told about the need to register, but not all. So there was, at that point, a division between the people who'd been included in the registry of registration for the events and the people who hadn't. And the way that fell meant that the vast majority who hadn't been included were actually Latinos who had come from different Latin American countries, and that they were, in many instances, left out of the events.
So the events were a little gringo heavy.
So there was kind of gringo heavy, European heavy, and then there were accusations, which I think were valid and should be definitely discussed, that it was a white savior convoy. And the accusations were made directly against Progressive International because of how they had overseen the organization of the convoy in a situation where you had hundreds of people travel to Havana, only to then find out that many of them couldn't actually attend the convoy events because they hadn't registered. But the
steps hadn't been taken to ensure that there was this level of equality among the people who visited as part of the convoy, which is really unfortunate.
And that coincided with then lots of these influencer types participating in the convoy and, raising the profile.
Being the public face of the convoy in a sense, but that was partly because the events had excluded the large body of non-influencer, non-celebrity activists.
Yeah, so there was definitely there's I mean, to be very diplomatic, lessons to be learned.
Lessons to be learned. Yes,
and shortcomings.
Let's talk about lessons then for the likes of the Irish government, because here you had a substantial Irish contingent, proportionately, 19 out of what did you say, about 600?
650.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Irish government does allegedly oppose the blockade of Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, we've had 33 examples where in Ireland will vote against the blockade at the General Assembly every time. So we have on record Ireland voting against against the blockade 33 times. But at the same time, the Irish government has done absolutely nothing materially, politically, or otherwise. And I think it needs to be mentioned that while 19 Irish citizens were in Cuba, as part of a convoy to mark the fact that there is an illegal blockade on Cuba from the United States, Taoiseach Micheál Martin was actually in the United States. He was being hosted, as we were in Havana, which is 90 miles south of Miami, as we were 90 miles south of Miami in Havana, Micheál Martin was in Washington, being hosted by the state that is responsible for the illegal blockade, which, as I said, if you're not allowing cancer medication and you're killing people.
And I'm sure he failed to mention it.
And
somehow.
I'm sure and I have no doubt that he failed to mention it. And, just kind of the reality for everyday Cubans, I suppose I can't speak to what their reality is because I'm not I'm not living that reality.
But you speak very good Spanish. You got out of the hotel. You stayed with a family in Cuba.
Yeah,
you weren't isolated like some influencer. You were out there in real Cuba.
So I stayed in a casa particular. So in Cuba, you have these casas particulares where it's kind of it's a little bit like a B&B, a bed and breakfast in a way, where a family will have a room and they'll rent that out to people who are traveling through Cuba. So I stayed with a family and had fantastic conversations with them about their daily reality. One of the most beautiful things, I think, was that their front door was always open and people were constantly coming and going for coffee or, these things that we don't do anymore. In many, for the years I lived in Amsterdam, you certainly couldn't knock on someone's door and you'd have to book in an appointment in advance. In this case, the door was always open. People were constantly coming and going. There was constantly coffee. If there were food, if they had food, they were giving out food to people.
If they had food. So there was a particular crisis dimension to this setting and this kind of warmth and this sense of community, as well as the kind of, if you like, the typical neighborliness.
Yeah, and I suppose it's this idea that it's a collective effort. So it's not, I have food, so I'm going to keep all the food for myself and just feed me and my family. It's, I have food, so I'm going to make sure that everyone in the building has access. So the doorman would come up and have his food. The man across the hall who was working on the apartment across the way, he would come in and have his food. The woman 2 floors up, she came down to eat. And I suppose that is again because I was staying there, so I had brought foreign currency. And so then kind of the community, and I got to speak to these people. So yeah, I suppose I did get an insight into that. It's my 3rd time in Cuba. So yeah, I suppose just making the distinction between this time last year when I was there and this time this year, you can really feel how much quieter things have gotten on the street in terms of, the fuel crisis does mean that things are moving a lot more slowly. Workers can't get to work, for example. There's a lot less public transport. Obviously, that has a knock-on effect then for your wages if you're working in the private sector. Because, if you're working in a hotel, for example, and you don't manage to make it to work, the knock-on effect of that, or if you're in a restaurant or, a tourist resort or these places, if you don't manage to make it to work. And then also just on the hunger, I mean, if there's very little fuel, food can't be transported. So food that's being produced in the countryside won't be transported to the city, or produce that comes in through Havana. It's really difficult to then distribute that throughout Cuba because again, the fuel. So everything kind of comes back to the fuel, and kind of the knock-on effects of that. And then also with the blackouts, I mean, it's fuel related, but it's also related to the fact that there's such a crisis in terms of the components that are required to keep the national energy grid up and running. So because of the blockade, it's been almost impossible to do any upgrading of the infrastructure around the energy grid for decades. And so I always give the example of if you have a light bulb, if a street lamp, for example, the light bulb goes, there might be no bulb in the whole of Cuba to fit that. Like, I remember my first time going to Cuba was in 2006 and being struck by how dark the streets were, but they had street lights, and asking, why is it so dark? Can you not turn on the electricity, or what's going on? And they said, no, at the moment we have no bulbs. We're waiting for bulbs to come, but there's because of the blockade, we can't get the bulbs. So at that particular moment, and they might end up resolving that. But I think because in the last 5 or so years, since 2021, Cuba has been put on this state sponsor of terrorism list.
Oh, Christ.
So any country that does, or any entity that does business with Cuba, then can potentially be accused of terrorism. So if you have a business...
So it's blockade plus.
Yeah. So if you have a business and you sell light bulbs, you might think twice about selling your light bulbs to the Cuban government, if that might land you with a terrorism charge. So that's the reality. That's how the blockade plays out. It affects every single aspect of life in Cuba. But despite that, the Cuban people are incredibly resourceful, resilient. Like, just before I left, the Farati, I should call him, the host, the host in the Casa Particular where I was staying, like, he was busy fixing a broken fan, and he had managed to rewire the thing from scratch because the fan had broken and the power had come back, so he was able to test if it worked or not, and eventually he got it working. And I had gone there. I had gone to Cuba thinking it was about to collapse because that's what we're being told in the media. And when I said that to people, they were really offended by that, and astounded, and rightly so. I shouldn't have doubted their capacity to they've been resisting this for decades. And this is a particularly difficult moment. There was also a very difficult moment after the Soviet Union collapsed. So they have had difficult periods, and the resilience and the resistance and the experience gets them through. And I think one of the moments that I kind of realized actually they will be fine, I was walking through one of the streets and I saw a group of older adults doing Tai Chi in the park. And no media is going to tell you that. Older adults regularly get together in Cuba and practice Tai Chi. No media source is going to tell you that that's happening. The children are still in school, and that's been one of the priorities, that children will continue to go to school. And then the other priority is the hospitals. So even though they are under, great strain, the state has made available electric vehicles that will be able to transport the staff to the hospitals. So medical personnel have been given priority so that they will be put on a bus route where there is an electronic vehicle that will guarantee that those staff will get to work. And we visited one of the hospitals, one of the main hospitals in Havana, which is Hermanos Almeida. How am I saying that wrong? Hermanos Almeida Hospital. And that particular day they had done 28 surgeries. Now, I don't know anything about hospitals in Dublin, but I just wonder, is there any hospital in Dublin that does 28 surgeries in one day? And would they be able under those conditions? Yeah. And I suppose it's a testament to the socialist kind of, the socialist state and the belief in that you will prioritize in a moment of crisis, keeping your healthcare system going and keeping your education system going. And that's where the priority is. Cultural events continue to take place. I think it was the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra that played. I think it was Vienna, but I could be wrong. I mean, there's an incredible cultural life taking place in Havana, and continues even under these really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking in our last episode about the World Cup and sports washing in the United States, and it is intriguing to imagine this starvation, but also this resistance happening 90 miles off the shores of the United States while it hosts this great cultural festival of sport this summer, but that it is continuing to commit this desperate crime against the Cuban people, but also that the Cuban people continue to resist that crime. Was there anything you wanted to add, Roman, to that?
Yeah, like, I mean, I just to go back to Ian O'Doherty's piece, I thought was quite funny. You know, it seems to be kind of a theme with people like him where they don't engage with the kind of substance of like why is NECAP going to Cuba? Like, what's
To be cool. They're just
Yeah.
going to be cool.
yeah, like what's actually happening in Cuba that means that they have to go there, or that, you know, other people have to go there and bring aid. Why is that? Does it have anything to do with the Americans? You know, he doesn't want to touch on that. And there's a recurring theme where people like Ian, it's the same in Iran. They have a lot to say about, you know, political prisoners, which is a legitimate point to make, of course, but they don't want to talk about school children being murdered, or they don't want to talk about the West's involvement in the kind of the real hardship that goes on in those places. And there's a kind of a hypocrisy as well, where in his article, he's sort of suggesting that because NECAP don't call out every single bad thing that's happening in a particular country, that, you know, that they're hypocrites, that, you know, they're not legitimate because they don't do that. But in his article, he doesn't mention once that it's the Americans that are responsible for the embargo in the first place.
You could call it breathtaking hypocrisy.
Yes, exactly.
I think on that note, we'll call it a podcast, guys. It's been great. Thank you so much, Niamh, obviously, for your special contribution today. And thank you, Roman Shortall, as well. You can shout down the party line by emailing theditchpartyline@gmail.com. Obviously, keep up with The Ditch on all your apps, by WhatsApp, etc. Support with a donation or subscription. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.